so thanks for coming. I guess this turned into just an excuse for us to get together and talk about grain, which is awesome. So thanks for coming out. And the event is put on by the Flatirons Young Farmers Coalition, and it's sponsored by a grant from Boulder County through their Sustainable Agriculture Fund. And we have a whole system of workshops going on this summer and into next year. So there's a business fundamentals curriculum, and then there's this small scale grains curriculum. So there'll be another workshop in the fall around harvesting and post-harvest processing. And then we're gonna be continue our animal husbandry workshops. So that will include some, what's that? Oh, that's gonna include so we've already done hogs, and we're gonna have a cattle workshop, and then we'll also be working with, we're doing a chicken slaughter event, demonstration event pretty soon. And I think are we doing sheep?
Yeah, sheep is August
1st, so. Yeah, so there's a lot going on with Young Farmers Coalition. And then I just wanted to introduce this space. So this is the Treehouse Farm Collective. And it's the property is owned by Alice and Carl of the Golden Hoof, and so myself and my farm partners. So I'm Helen. I'm the chair of the education committee with the Flatirons Young Farmers Coalition, and I'm also the owner of Farmette Flowers. So I operate the flower farm on this land along with my partners Cody and Melissa, who run Speedwell Farm and Gardens. And yeah, so we're using this land together because we can't afford it individually. And so we have ourselves plus 3 tenants in the barn and a tenant in the house. And so that makes it possible for us to farm here and have our businesses. So I'm gonna let Sean introduce the rest of everybody and do a little housekeeping. Okay.
Thanks, Helen. My name's Sean, and I'm also part of the education committee, and thank you for coming today. So just a quick thing, we're videotaping, and what that'll mean is that everyone needs to be talking into a mic when they're talking, and so the speakers will be passing the mic around as we're having the discussion, and then there'll be a separate mic for the audience. And so if you guys are asking questions, maybe the best thing would be for you to raise your hand, and then I will bring you the mic, and then we can break in with the questions and things like that. And let's see, what else? Oh, gotta get my list. Oh, and then also, just for clarity's sake, like if you get asked a question as a speaker, if you can just repeat the question, that'll probably make it easier for everyone. And if it gets really, really hot, we can turn the fan on. Are folks, do we want to try that straight off, or how are folks feeling? You've had worse? All right. We can gauge it and see how it goes.
Supposedly we have AC in here, but
it's okay. Okay, and so I'll just do a quick introduction here, and then I'll let these guys talk more about themselves, given that the first question is asking them about themselves. This is Matt, and he is honorary member of Treehouse Collective, and also founder of Jolly Radish Farm, among a bunch of other things that he does. And then this is Keith. Keith is with MetaCarbon Farm. They are just east of 36 and just south of 66. Is that correct? Right, on Hygiene Road. And then this is Nick with Elk Run Farm / Drylands Agroecologic Research. Did I say that right? Agroecology Research. And I'll let him talk about what he does also. And let me think. Oh, and the other thing that we're also offering is the chapter is offering, we've set aside funds for consulting. And so if you're interested in getting any help from any of these 3 folks, and there'll also be a list on the website, just get in touch with us, send us an email, and we'll get you set up with that. All right, so just to start off, we'll just head down the line here. And our first question is if you could just give an introduction of yourself, a little bit about yourself and the farm, and where you're farming, and what led you to farming, and how long you have been farming, what you grow, what your goals are, and how has it been, and what is it like navigating as a young farmer in this area, and are there any people that you reach out to for help or mentorship?
Hi, my name is Matt Kuebbing. I've been farming professionally for about a decade now, out on the East Coast and out here for about 7 years. I got my undergraduate and master's degree at University of Maryland in plant and soil science, and worked briefly at the USDA before I realized I really just wanted to work with my hands and grow food and farm. And I just kind of caught the bug and just been working on farms since. And yeah, after being a farm manager at another farm in this area for a while, having experience growing grains and a lot of other veggies, I realized I needed a break from like the 80 to 100 hour weeks of farming. So I'm kind of scaled back and helping out the Treehouse collective here, growing a couple acres on the land here and helping manage everything. And we have an acre of wheat growing here, and I have some veggies that I'm primarily growing for the food bank, but selling a little bit wholesale to chefs. I also have another half-acre plot of corn and beans off the farm. And yeah, it's just like Helen was saying, it's a blessing to farm with friends here and kind of collaborate as a group versus having to do it all on your own. It can be a challenge sometimes. But as far as mentorship goes, I mean, there's tons of people in the local farming community that I've had the blessing of being able to reach out to and learn from, and then people that have equipment have been super kind to share it with us this year as well. There's somebody down the street, a farmer John Ellis, who's going to be helping swat our wheat crop so that we can get the combine in to pick it up because it's got some weeds in it. What was the other question on there?
How has it been for you farming here in Boulder County?
It's been a blessing. There's a great community that appreciates good veggies, and there's a lot of young farmers who I feel like are collaborating more and more, and it's awesome that the Flatirons Young Farming Coalition got started here like 4 years ago or so, and there's a lot of great farms to learn from and work for, and as much as it is a challenge to buy land, there is accessibility to some land, and ideally capital is coming around too with the soil loan group and Boulder sustainability grants, and hopefully there'll be more cash flowing to young farmers in the future here because there's so much wealth in the community. And as long as you know how to deal with the lack of water, it is kind of a great area to raise animals and grow veggies and grow flowers. And as long as you're aware that there'll probably be hail here at some point and manage for that. But yeah.
I'm Keith. I'm part of MetaCarbon Farms. My friends and I started the farm 2.5 years ago, like 3 Mays ago. We originally started out trying to be a hemp farm. That first season, starting in May, we didn't get a very good crop out. Obviously, we started very late, and then transitioned very aggressively into market garden from there. And then last year had a very good, successful crop, and this year we're really just focusing only on the market garden. We did a small wheat crop last year, which is where my relevance here comes. You'll hear our story with that eventually. But yeah, so I'm new to farming. I didn't have any background at all. I had grown in cannabis throughout my 20s, worked with my hands in demolition and stuff like that, and those all naturally led to being adept at farming. Our team is a bunch of misfits, though I will say. None of us really knew. We had one person who really knew what he was doing, and he started the dream. And then we've all kind of taken the reins from there, and we're very excited to move forward with the future. We got a good deal with our land and our space, and we're very happy there. And the future does look bright, but yeah, it's a slow start, and we want to be on year 7 right now, but it's still year 2, so we're figuring it out very candidly. The systems and the neighbor and the community around us are all wonderful, honestly, meeting all the young farmers, and Nick is right across the street from us, so he's been abundantly helpful, and we've been just meeting more and more people and learning what even possibilities come from, like machinery that could be borrowed, or yeah, I don't know, there's a lot to it, obviously. Our goals, I guess, in time, we're trying to become the whole regenerative picture. We want to have animals and all the closed loops and market garden and events, and eventually, yeah, that's, I don't know, again, we're slowly working towards it, I'd say. yeah, I don't know what else to really say. That's it.
Heck yeah, thanks guys. Hello everybody, my name is Nick DiDomenico. Manager, operator at Elk Run Farm. In the last couple of years, we've also started a nonprofit, and so the whole farming endeavor has been kind of under the umbrella of the nonprofit, Drylands Agroecology Research. What really brought me to farming was in my early 20s, I had quit competitive skiing and dropped out of college, and I had moved to South America, and I was down there just doing some soul searching, some different travels, and also engaged with indigenous communities down there, and was working on a bunch of off-grid properties there. And I learned about permaculture, and there people were starting to set up food systems. So just kind of young kid that I was, helped them out building their permaculture systems, and learned about permaculture and building soil and all of that, and kind of come from immigrant Italian family, always had big gardens, hunting family back in New Jersey. But when I came back to Colorado, I grew up in Boulder, came back to Colorado after some years in South America and was kind of not sure what to do, and just sort of dropped into the farming community here, started volunteering on vegetable farms, and was really passionately helping out a good friend of mine who had a dairy in Lyons. And he taught me all about animal husbandry and butchering, and taking care of his cows, taking care of his pigs, and that was really inspiring for me. And just out of the nature of really wanting to just grow my own food and live off the land and live a more balanced, healthy lifestyle, I helped my parents find a small piece of land just north of Hygiene Road on Highway 36, and it was really affordable at the time, and nobody really had seen it as an opportunity for farming. It had probably been used for grazing maybe 20 years before that. There was some like old cattle infrastructure on the property and some cattle chutes and lean-tos, but there had never been any cropping on the property. Not really any soil, pretty hilly, no water rights. But luckily there's a really good shallow well, and we've come to find it's a pretty prolific well depending on how much we're getting rain. It's like 40 foot deep, pretty much artisan spring, like is it around the same altitude as some other springs right around Lyons. So all of our water comes from the well, and then the water that we capture in all the earthworks and regenerative design stuff that we've done. So being that there wasn't any soil, not really any not any real systems for farming built. The first thing I did was bring in a bunch of livestock. So started out with pigs, kind of used pigs to clear certain areas, used pigs to build fertility, and kept pigs like in intensive management systems for a couple of years to build up enough fertility to where I was later able to dig contour swales and plant hedgerows and windrows of useful and like forage and fodder crops for animals, so like apple, pear, hazelnut, nitrogen fixing shrubs, all of that. And so now where our grain fields are old pig paddocks actually. Through the nonprofit, we've started a research program. So we're doing soil testing, kind of ecosystems, data collection. And so we've been taking data with that program for about a year now, built around 7 to 8 inches of topsoil in the forest garden and the veggie fields, and we're up to like about 2.5, 3 inches of topsoil in the pastures. There was like pretty much no usable pasture for the sheep, so now we run sheep, chickens, and pigs, chickens for eggs. We have like 1/3 of an acre in like a diverse orchard forest garden, so we grow like a whole apothecary of medicinal herbs that my partner Marissa uses in her tinctures and teas and apothecary stuff. The forest garden is just like a place where we've tested all these different exotic crops, all sorts of different berries and fruits and kind of everything that we could possibly grow using these kind of contour systems. So after some years got funding through the nonprofit to build contour swales in the lower 7 or 8 acres that were super degraded. We had been using pigs to regenerate pasture and build enough soil to actually plant pasture crops, and then we ended up digging contour swales with machinery through the nonprofit and planted around 2,000 trees without irrigation. So pretty much using that as breeding and trials for silvopasture and drylands crops in this climate. And all those trees have only gotten watered just the one time we planted them. So fertilized with compost tea, inoculated, and then just left of their own accord. And we expected to lose a good percentage of those trees, and actually have been around 70 to 80% success in establishing like about nine or 10 silvopasture crops in drylands conditions. So that's been pretty exciting to see. So breeding and trialing the silvopasture crops, and then in our grain fields, we're using animal rotations, so really fast rotations. We're growing corn, sorghum, amaranth, and dry beans. I got all the seeds from Rich Pecoraro maybe 4 or 5 years ago when we started planting them, and just did a trial with all of them. 3 kinds of corn, 3 kinds of sorghum, or no, the sorghum was there was only one good edible human kind of sorghum that we trialed, and then 3 types of amaranth and 3 types of dry beans. And we've pretty much stuck to the Chihuahua Blue, just your classic, like it's like an African sorghum. The Golden Giant Amaranth, Scarlet Amaranth, and Hopi black beans have done the best for us. So we've been growing those in the fields, and then as soon as they're ready to harvest, harvesting all by hand, and then clearing the fields with the pigs, and then clearing again with the chickens, fertilizing that way. We've been hand prepping and hand harvesting, hand threshing all the grains. So it's all like homestead scale grain harvest and cultivation. Basically subsistence farming as far as I can tell. We've been able to harvest like about 300 to 400 pounds of grains from like the 1/4 acre fields per year. And I think what's really cool for us is just seeing that the soil is actually building in depth every year. The microbiology is increasing. The fungal and bacterial networks are increasing every year through the tests that we're doing. The infiltration rate is increasing. The water holding capacity is increasing. So actually the soil is getting better each and every year that we grow the grains and use these rotations. So that's pretty exciting to see. All the grains are grown close to drylands, right? So we have enough water in the well that I have like really simple grid drip irrigation that runs through the fields, and I can flood them like maybe once a week until about July. And then after that, it's all drylands. They just go kind of on their own, and there's just enough fertility and soil in the fields to really hold all that moisture, which is really cool. And this is like, I think the 5th year that we've grown those grains. And each year selecting the best seeds, planting with the rains in the spring to really maximize like the timing, actually hand mulching the fields, like doing crazy things that you really couldn't do at scale to just ensure that we'd get a crop using the drylands techniques. So none of it's really to make money. It's all like within the research program that we're doing and the demonstration for the nonprofit. From there, we've been engaging with 3 or 4 other farms in the area, a couple other like small permaculture installations that we've been doing, and just doing consulting, doing other earthworks, contour swales, ponds, excavation stuff, like on the larger scale. Master planning, systems design, that kind of stuff for some other folks in the area. Planted around like 15,000 trees in the past 5 years through the nonprofit. And so big into the agroforestry stuff, and just been growing the grains as kind of a side project and to feed ourselves. So that's pretty much the spiel.
Thanks, Nick. Nick kind of touched upon this, but can you guys talk about what kinds of grain have you or are you growing right now? And can you share your hurdles, successes, and your lessons learned? And is there anything you wish you knew beforehand?
I've personally had experience growing all types of grain, from lots of flint corn and dried beans on the East Coast, where it's a whole nother challenge with getting rain during harvest season, and then growing like small amounts of sorghum and amaranth at like homestead scales, because they're amazing crops in terms of nutrition, but it's hard to scale up, make money and harvest. But if you do the research and find the right seeds, it could be something that everybody should be growing, because it's like amaranth is one of the most nutritional seeds, and it's delicious, and if you let it become a weed, it's like can be a really problematic thing, but if you integrate it in with animal rotations, it's great. But in the past 5 years, I've been blessed to be able to grow grain out here at like 3 to 7 acre scale, and I've learned a ton about, you know, how to address the weed issues and organic management and what it requires for nutrition and what makes sense in terms of integrating it with animals and veggie crops. And weed management is a big consideration because for vegetables, at scale, you really want to kind of make sure that a crop you can't hand weed like wheat isn't going to be somewhere where there's a ton of perennial weeds that are going to go to seed, like thistle and bindweed, which can make harvest a problem. And you want to make sure that the annual weed pressure is low and that you get your timing on planting right, or you have access to tools like a tine weeder or a rotary hoe that you can go through with a light tractor and kind of cultivate it out in the spring, because wheat is like a grass, so it's pretty easy to clean up some of these broadleaf weeds. And the same thing with corn and dry beans. If you have the right cultivation techniques, they're great to grow at scale. But at a smaller scale, you know, it's totally practical to hand weed if you just had a bed or two of dry beans at a, you know, in an acre market garden or something, or a couple beds of corn for flour. But the profit margins aren't really there like they are for other vegetable crops. But in terms of having it as a crop in your rotation that can build soil, provide wind protection, I think it makes sense for a lot of farms to have some grains integrated. But without the right machinery, like a small scale combine can run anywhere from $5,000 to $50,000. And if you're trying to grow more than an acre, it really makes sense to have access to that. And fortunately in our community, we have farmers who are willing to share that equipment. And another consideration is seed cleaning equipment that can get pretty expensive. And there's a lot of really fun techniques you can use to use the wind and do what they did before they had these fancy seed cleaners that we're blessed to have now. But it's just another hand labor, time consuming step that can be a challenge when you're trying to make a living farming. But things I learned from growing the wheat at Aspen Moon at scale is that you really need to pay attention to weather conditions as far as harvest goes. It never makes sense to leave wheat standing if you have the ability to harvest it, even if it's a little wet here, because you never know when that big rainstorm or hailstorm might come and ruin everything. Another thing to consider is what's your soil fertility like? Because even though wheat seems like it would be a cover crop, it really needs a good amount of nitrogen nutrition to make it to get a quality crop, and kind of like corn. And so either application of compost or running animals on your field beforehand. I noticed at Black Cat just down the street here, they tend to run their pigs through their old veggie fields and then plant the wheat into that. And then they follow their wheat with another pass through with the pigs, and I think that helps get nitrogen on the straw so that it can turn into carbon in the soil. Otherwise, you know, the straw from the wheat crop, if you don't bale it up, is going to capitalize on any nitrogen availability in the soil and make it so it's really hard to grow a vegetable or grain crop afterwards. So I think the integration of animals, grain, vegetables, tree crops is just a huge benefit if you can deal with the challenges that it presents. And hopefully in the future in Boulder County specifically, there'll be enough grants that can fund farmer access to these larger scale equipments that would allow small scale farmers like us to grow an acre of wheat and harvest it. And even though it's a barely profitable crop, it might be able to be sensible, because it is really healing the soil in a sense and fixing a lot more carbon than other food crops would.
So when we first moved onto our property in May, we hired a local farmer, I think Todd Hazelbush. He's got a lot of machinery over by the airport out here. He came and flipped over our land for us, and we had a swath of a half acre of barren land that we knew we needed to plant something on. You just don't want to leave barren land. And so we were talking with Moxie Bread. He's got the pizza oven right outside, but he gave us about 400 pounds of grain, 8 bags of grain. And we hired Todd to come seed drill it into our land because we just knew we needed to do something. And we did not do all the necessary prep beforehand. So we had an absolutely nightmare year of half of our crop was covered in bindweed. We needed a hand scythe and hand thresh the other half of that half acre. It took hours and hours and hours and hours and hours to do, probably 80 man hours. And we were already a struggling young farm with not enough hands on deck. And we ended up with about 100 pounds of seed in the end. After all the cleaning and everything, we reached out to everyone. There was a lady nearby who let us use our grain cleaner. I wish we'd had access to a combine or pigs beforehand. Those things would have been very helpful. But all in all, we were left with an experience that we don't want to do this again, because we ended up with a lot of straw that was great for the mulch for the rest of the field, but then a lot of wasted seed that's now actually reseeding, and it's mixed even worse in with the grains or with the weeds that were there. So a lot of prep. I wish we'd been better prepared, and I think we will take on grains again in the future, but we had to learn a lot of lessons, and we don't have a lot of hands on deck this year, so that was a hard one to take and then recover from. And we still have the scythe, and yeah, definitely not a profitable crop for us. I don't know, after speaking with these two guys before, I'm learning that it probably isn't going to be very profitable in general, and we have a whole market garden to focus on, and we're branching out into animals and other things that do require our attention more. So I think if we're going to we would lean to more other cover crops before we go back to wheat, even though there is such a usable feature to it, and it's got lots of product that comes out with straw and seeds. And so yeah, it was a fairly demoralizing experience, but it doesn't need to be for everyone else. But yeah, being very well prepared is something I would recommend to anybody who's thinking about doing it. Don't just say you got some blank land and let's throw some seed out there. Because yeah, all in all, we didn't even give back the seed. We were supposed to give back the seed that we were given as like a repayment, and then we could keep the extra, and we didn't even make that. So it was embarrassing and just kind of demoralizing for the whole crew on a lot of levels.
This is a good cover crop.
Yeah, absolutely. It was. We didn't have barren land there. It helped, and I can tell this year that part of the field looks way better than it would have if we just let it go to like the other parts of the field that we let bindweed just run rampantly. Like the bindweed flowers, you looked out and they were just white. It looked like snow in July everywhere. And so at least the wheat field where that looks a lot better this year. I don't know too much about our soil biology and the testing of the rates and all of those things that would come with more time. We've just been so busy, hands in the dirt, trying to keep up with what we've done. So it was just an addition to, we already 4 people trying to do 1.5 acres of like actual true production market gardening, and then adding in the 1/2 acre. It was difficult, but absolutely, I see its worth. I see its use. We're moving on to corn. We talked to Nick about beans, and I think, I don't know, we'll go back to it, but it's hard to say when or how soon or what scale. But this, 1/2 acre was a lot. It's a lot. So.
Heck yeah, that's all good stuff. It's really good for me to hear about some of the wheat cultivation, and it's not really something that I've tried my hand at ever. But heard about it a lot, been around it a little bit and interested in it as well. And for me, I really imagine grains in regenerative systems being used as an alley crop in agroforestry systems. So I see great potential for that, and in fast or slower rotations with animals, like graze pigs or sheep or cattle in a paddock for a year, just like you're saying with black cat, and then transition into grains. And for me, my experience prior to growing the crops at our farm was mostly just around blue corn and other Southwest regional drylands grain crops. Rich Pecoraro had always grown all the different projects that he had around here. He always liked to grow his Chihuahua Blue and always had really nice crops of that. And I was always inspired by that and seeing how he could grow corn. And just like the folklore of this area, and then traveling down south in New Mexico and Arizona and being around some of our native relatives and what they talk about, how important the corn is to their way of living, to their way of thinking, their way of being. So we've been experimenting with different corn seeds that I had gotten from some folks down south too, like red corns and green corns and all these different kinds of beautiful colored corns that they had been growing in the Southwest for a while. And then, when we started really wanting to trial the grain crops, it was just out of this like staple food necessity, like we were growing a bunch of veggies for ourselves, selling a little bit of it, like really small CSAs, 5-10 family CSAs, just to get rid of our surplus. And we were raising meat and we were hunting on the property. And so we really had those bases covered. But, just like everybody, we enjoy our breads, our grains, our cereals, just, what felt like nourishing staple foods to have around. And so I went and saw Rich and was kind of discussing with him what my circumstances were, the fact that we didn't have much access to irrigation. And so he really suggested, stronger than anything else, the Chihuahua blue corn seeds, which have become really like the staple of what we grow. Like at least 60% of our fields are in Chihuahua blue corn, just because it's the most prolific, it's the most drought tolerant that we've seen of any of the crops. In the conditions that we have, it's grown the best of anything else. Like per the amount of space and the weight that we glean from the harvest, it's been the best crop. And then the amaranth and sorghum and the dry beans, like for me, all of those crops were ones that I could process by hand. We didn't really, at the scale that we're farming at, we didn't even really want to bring in machinery. So we prep the fields by hand, we plow the fields by hand, we seed them by hand. And that's definitely a labor of love that's only afforded by the nonprofit status and the funding that we get to do the kind of research that we do. So that's really nice, just to be using sort of a different model to be cultivating under. But I think, again, what's really cool about the amaranth, the sorghum, the dry beans, we can dry them in small spaces. We can thresh them with just hand drills, like threshing, if nobody knows, is the process of removing the seed from the hull of the grain, which is a pretty important process to make the grains edible, right? So what I had heard about wheat and barley and rye and some of the other like more common cereal grains that are grown at scale was that you typically need machinery to process it, and that's just not something that we really wanted to get into. So we were just researching about different Southwest traditional grains. We had heard amaranth had been grown all the way down into South America, and like a close relative of quinoa, kind of like smaller quinoa grains. And really quite easy to thresh by hand, to winnow by hand with fans. So that's been pretty fun, just to kind of go back to the traditional methods of cultivation and cleaning and preparation. And, we're still learning how to cook with them. It's this whole like renewal of our own micro food culture, so to speak, right? Where, the blue corn is pretty easy. There's certain ways that people cook the shell of it off in this process called nixtamalization. And apparently corn is not really edible until you do that, although I've heard it looks like from the packaging, a lot of corn products that you get in the store are not nixtamalized. But just traditional way of processing it, again, you cook it with wood ash or lime and you remove the skin, and we grind that and make tortillas with that. The amaranth we cook like into porridge, make porridges and like breads and sorghum breads, sorghum amaranth breads, try to ferment the grains and make breads and flatbreads out of that. So for us, it's this whole preservation of food culture and developing this food culture around these staple grains that have been grown in this area for a long time.
Thanks, Nick.
I just wanted to follow up one thing Nick was saying with the harvesting. Because, corn and dry beans are larger seeded crops, I think that facilitates an easier hand harvesting experience. But corn being bred from teosinte, like the ancient South American like grass, it's become this huge, even all these ancient beautiful varieties are big, large, nice cobs that you can pull that have 200 seeds on them versus one head of wheat is super small. So if you're going through, even if you're using old techniques like scything and binding them and carrying them out of the field, just hand harvesting corn, you could probably hand harvest a quarter acre 20 times as fast as you could a quarter acre of wheat. And I think the same thing goes for dry beans. So it lends itself to more small scale production. And in theory, you can get a better yield from corn because it's a C4 plant and they've done an amazing 2,000 years of breeding work on it that I think we just need to pay our respects to the ancient cultures that did such amazing work to grow this crop. And so the dry beans being a legume and corn, it's a natural companionship that I feel like is great. And then the wheat being kind of a different crop coming from more Mediterranean climates where it was bred. It's something that our climate also works really well in, and there's been varieties that have kind of been developed since it's been brought over to America. But once again, yeah, it's without the machinery, it is quite the challenge to harvest. But I think there is a place for wheat in our systems here, farming systems, and in our nutrition and livelihood, as long as it's fermented well and cooked well. But yeah, I'd highly recommend everybody just plant some old-fashioned corn for cornmeal in their garden, because it's so easy to harvest, and you can buy like a cheap mill to hand mill it at home. And nixtamalizing is a pretty easy process if you get into that. And Nick was correct, almost no products on the market do that, but it makes all the nutrition way more accessible. And I think they found that the Aztecs and Mayans found they had to do that to survive, because they weren't getting enough nutrition otherwise. But what a blessing to work on all these other cultures, breeding work, and be able to grow these plants and steward them again. But I found the Hopi blue to be really good, or the Chihuahua blue and the Hopi pink, super good, drought tolerant grains that you can get away with just a couple irrigations. And wheat, in theory, you can get away with almost no irrigation at all if you have to. You just plant it early enough in the spring, and roots kind of chase the water down. But yeah, I just wanted to follow up on what Nick was saying.
Well, that actually leads into the next question, which Nick has also touched upon. Can you talk about varieties that seem to be best suited for the climate that we're in, and differences in varieties? And what do you, from your personal experience, if you've tried to sell here, what's best for the market here in our county? And what varieties do you feel are best for end goods, like bread and pasta and tortillas and cornmeal, things like that?
Cool. I found being Boulder County that if you can get access to the right people and the right marketplace, almost any special grain crop you grow is going to sell itself for usually a premium over what it could go, not only on the wholesale market, but in the rest of the country. There's a lot of phenomenal bakeries here, Moxie being one, that will help buy a lot of wheat at a good wholesale price, a lot of corn. But even at a small scale, at the farmer's market, people are hungry for these local grains and pay crazy high prices, in my opinion, that I wish. Food should be expensive, but at the same time, I want people who don't have the income to be able to afford really high quality food. So there's a balance to be found, but I know fresh milled cornmeal goes for at the farmer's market for $8 a pound, and fresh milled wheat flour goes for $4 a pound, and dry beans go for $10 a pound. So this is all a great thing for farmers, because it means it is possible for us to farm that at a small scale and make a living. But hopefully there'll be subsidies or ways that we can make these products accessible to people, so people don't have to eat all commodity farmed wheat and corn. Because when we're competing with farms in Kansas that are growing 1,000 acres of wheat, they're selling it for 2 cents a pound versus $1 a pound, which seems to me to be a reasonable, fair price for the nutrition you're getting. But it all comes to how the American agriculture system is built on large-scale commodity agriculture. And so when we're growing these unique varieties, we have the opportunity to sell them at a higher price. But I just want to figure out in the future a way to get these unique products to the people who originally bred them, like all these Native American communities who don't have access to quality food anymore, as well as to everybody at all income levels who deserves to have fresh dry beans and fresh corn and unique products like amaranth and quinoa that oftentimes are brought in from exploited communities in other parts of the world. So there's a lot of work to be done, but I'm excited by where it's moving right now. In terms of, what was the first part of that question? Sorry.
What varieties grow well in this area?
So in terms of my experience growing wheat, almost every variety of wheat will do acceptable here, because we're fortunate to have usually a fairly wet spring, or wet enough that you can get a good start to the wheat, and not so cold that winter wheats will get killed off. And then it tends to dry down enough around harvest time that you don't get a lot of the fungal diseases that they get east of the Mississippi or where they grow it in the Pacific Northwest. And we have a shorter growing season, so some varieties of corn can be tricky. There's special varieties from the Andes that I think need a different light cycle than we have here. And I tried to grow one in my garden once, and it got 18 feet tall, but never produced any corn. But most corns that were bred here, bred in Mexico, do great, as long as you're set to hand harvest them, because sometimes they're longer season than the hybrid corns a lot of commodity farmers go around here to harvest with a combine. And then, I've seen some farmers bring in corn from different cultures and regions that might not be as drought tolerant, and whether that's the best idea. I mean, if you have irrigation water, you certainly can grow almost any variety of corn, but if we want to try and, make the most of our limited water situation and grow corns that were adapted here, I think, working on the ancient ancestry of knowledge in the seed breeding, and Rich has access to a lot of those great varieties and dry beans as well, that you can get away with minimal irrigation and kind of maximize your yield. The Chihuahua Blue and Hopi Pink is another one I've grown that does super well. I'm growing.
Is Painted Mountain a flint, or is it?
It is a flint. I'm growing a variety that's actually from like modern breeding work up in Montana. That. Oh yeah. So Helen asked if Painted Mountain corn is a flint. That's the variety I'm growing this year, and it was bred to be a very short season corn. So because of our wet spring, I had trouble getting into the soil in time to get one of these more appropriate corns planted. So I planted this kind of in very late June, and it's like an 80-day corn that they bred to be super drought tolerant and hail tolerant up in pretty extreme part of America. And I just want to kind of see what does well, and it's a very diverse specimen of corn. So I'm going to select out the ears that do the best and see if I can get a good variety going out of that. What's that? It's a mixed color, so you get some ears that are more red and purple, and some that have more yellow and pink in it. But I think it's important to also steward a lot of these other genetic resources like Rich and Nick are doing with varieties, and then continually selecting for what works every year, because as time goes on, the varieties tend to get even more acclimated to our growing regions and the changing climate. So it's super important, not within just with grains, but saving seed for every vegetable out here, because as the climate changes, the seeds are going to be self-selecting if we select open pollinated seed to do the best. And wheat in particular is mostly self-pollinating, but I still think the genetics tend to get more adapted every year as you keep growing it and harvesting it. But as far as wheat goes, Sonoran White is one that does well in the southwestern U.S. It's a spring wheat that's good for tortillas, and you can make bread with it too, but it doesn't have quite as much gluten content. Turkey Red is a pretty amazing variety of winter wheat that actually came over to America in the 1800s, and they used to grow almost 2 million acres of it across the Midwest before hybrid wheat came along, and now there's probably only less than 100,000 acres being grown. But you get these tall stalks sometimes that the straw is like 5 feet tall. So as far as a climate adaptable one that can fix carbon, it's a super great variety that should be brought back. And the yields might be a little less than some of those hybrid wheats, but I think it makes up for it in straw yield and just the quality of the flavor. And then there's a huge movement, specifically in our area and elsewhere around the country, to keep trialing new varieties of wheat from all over the world to see what works well. I grew a variety at the last farm I was working at called Blue Emmer, but it turns out it's not an emmer at all. It's more of a Durham wheat. But it did fairly well, but I think it's important to keep trialing these wheats to see what works, because there's different nutritional values and cooking opportunities for all of them. And same thing with the Durham wheats is what a lot of pasta makers use, and a lot of that wheat comes from Italy, and a lot of the American Durham wheat is shipped to Italy for their pasta. So it's very bizarre that there's not a better local system for getting it to pasta makers around the U.S. So I know a couple farms that are trialing new varieties of those this year. But my experience has been almost every heirloom wheat is going to grow all right in this climate because it's dry enough, but you might find varieties that you get much better yield without irrigating. And you can find varieties that might want irrigation, but whether that is profitable or not is still in question. And in general, the heritage wheats that we're growing here now don't want to be irrigated or fertilized as highly as the hybrid wheats that were bred during the Green Revolution to be about 2 feet high. They were bred that way so that they could fertilize them and get bigger yields, and it was nobly done to fix world hunger, but it ended up creating these crops that need herbicides, pesticides, and fertilizer in order to keep growing them. So if we continue breeding and working on systems that we can grow better yields of these heirloom varieties of wheat that they used to grow that have better nutrition and flavor, I think we can make up for the loss in yield by just finding better systems of growing.
One more question for you, Matt.
Yeah.
What wheat are you growing here right now?
So this year at the Treehouse Collective, Helen asked what wheat we have here this year that I planted, and our friend Andy, the baker at Moxie, got us a variety called Indian Jamu from this woman in California, and so far it's been doing great, but it's supposed to have very good gluten properties, and we'd like to see if it does well here, which it looks like it's going to be a good yield. We'll spread that seed around the community so more farmers can grow it.
I don't really have a lot. Actually, listening to you showed me how much I don't know, I will say, about all the different varieties, winter wheat, and there were a lot of things to take in there. We specifically chose a breed of wheat that was given to us by Andy as well. I can't remember the name because it was not a decision. I think Shay, our lead farmer at the time, was the one who really made the decision, was speaking with Andy, and but it grew up beautifully. We had to flood irrigate it right after we planted it, I think late June last year or early June last year, and we flood irrigated a couple times while we still had free water running through the ditch, because after a certain point the water flow in the creek runs low enough that you have to start charging, and so we weren't going to spend any of our water on that. But once it was free water, after the free water was shut off around end of June, everything just took off and it ended up getting about 3-4 feet tall. It was a wonderful variety for what it was. But yeah, I don't know. I wish I had more to say about it. We just don't have so much experience. We didn't sell any of it. Everything we have, we still have in the basement. We haven't milled it or done anything in processing it into flour. That was the other goal, was to turn it into raw wheat flour for no-knead breads to sell to people. But yeah, it's just, I don't know, just you. Yeah, absolutely.
Heck yeah, awesome. Yeah, it's really interesting hearing you talk about the different experiences you've had with the wheat grains. It's really, really cool. I was wondering too, it seems like when I was out in your field just now, it seemed like it was pretty easy to thresh the grains by hand, right? Yeah. And so the heirloom wheats are actually, is it possible to thresh them by hand, you think?
Absolutely. It's just
wow.
a lot of work.
Yeah, right. Wow. Because what I'd heard about hybridized wheat grains is that you can't even really thresh them or winnow at all by hand. It requires machinery, which is kind of an interesting phenomenon, I think. It's like creating these crops that humans need machinery to process and eat. It seems a little bit counterintuitive to me as a small scale farmer, but those are just some thoughts I had on that. And yeah, just like we've been talking, the Chihuahua Blue has been our star corn crop. We've experimented a little bit with Oaxacan green corn. I haven't tried the Hopi pink, but I'd like to try that one too. Even the Anastasi corn, I got some Anastasi seed from Marcus over here, and even that didn't do quite as well as our Chihuahua Blue. And maybe just because we'd been selecting it every year, maybe just because we'd been selecting the biggest cobs. The first couple of years, our corn barely grew 3-4 feet, maybe half of it cobbed. It just didn't have the water or the fertility to really do much. But what did fruit, that's the seed we saved. And the next year planting was 5-10 times better in every single year. It's pretty striking right now just to look in the cornfields that right now haven't gotten any water in a week or two, or maybe since the rain. I was 2 or 3 weeks ago? And we're 8 foot tall corn right now, just starting to tassel. It's amazing, but the fields are super fertile, and it's just these really small scale pockets that we're really just demonstrating the rotations with the grains and the animals. So that's been pretty cool to see. And then Rich Pecoraro would always talk about amaranth as this star Southwest grain crop that would just, you grow maybe one row of it one year, and the next year it's growing up alongside all your fences, and you just in the fall just take your trash bag over and shake it into the trash bag, and you just a little side hustle or whatever, however you want to think of it, It grows like crazy. It's got many relatives that are prolific weeds in this area, namely pigweed. And we've seen a little bit of crossbreeding between the cultivated amaranth and pigweed. And so we usually just try to thin our rows of anything that kind of starts to look more like pigweed. just in that the pigweed, the seeds are even smaller than the grain amaranth that we cultivate. And they're just harder to thresh, harder to winnow. They're even like sharp and prickly. So like a lot of our efforts in terms of breeding the amaranth has just been to select out the other weed amaranth family plants that are being bred into the crops. And then when we trialed them originally, we also had, we had the two that we grow now, the Golden Giant, which grows the biggest. It's kind of gold and green and yellow. And then the Scarlet, which I just found to be really beautiful, and you can make dyes out of the chaff. So like whatever you winnow off is this really bright scarlet, purple, pink color, and that soaked in water makes really nice dyes. So it's just a beautiful plant to see growing, and also not quite as prolific as the Golden Giant, but pretty high yields from the Scarlet as well. And we've noticed the same thing. It's coming up as a weed like almost everywhere on the property where there's enough moisture and enough soil. So we just let it go in those places too, and harvest it at the same time and dry it and winnow it the same way. The sorghum, we've just always gone with that African sorghum, and apparently that comes from a region of Africa that is really similar to this climate and maybe even a little bit more arid. So typically grown as a drylands, super drought tolerant crop. And I've heard people make like beers. You can make really good beer apparently with it. You can make breads and all that, and we've been grinding it into flour and using it for breads and crackers. And then the Hopi black bean, I guess that's not really a grain as much as a legume, but in our sense, we're growing it with our grain crops as a staple food crop. And we originally trialed Pinto, Anastasia, and Hopi black, and the Hopi black did by far the best. All the other stuff could not handle even like 2 or 3 weeks of dry weather. And the Hopi black, I mean, even in like completely dry soil, you stick your fingers all the way into the soil completely dry, the Hopi black is still like going strong and producing strong. And they're just really small little beans, and probably have always been grown drylands. So they do really well in our fields. Yeah, is there anything else that I missed? Yeah, I mean, again, we've really taken a completely different approach to the growing of our grains in that we are growing for our own farmstead, homestead, little community there. We have 3 interns that are working with us and 2 other folks living on the property with me and my partner, Marissa. And between those quarter-acre plots, that's about enough grains for us to eat in 1 year. And I think it's really cool, just the synergy of the livestock systems with the cropping systems. And I really do profess till the cows come home, like how important that will be for regenerative, large scale and economically viable systems. Is just like these multiple yields in one season, these systems that are beneficial to one another, like in our cornfields, by the time we put the pigs in, we are barely feeding the pigs, and they're just rooting up all the roots of the corn. They're chewing on the stalks, which have an incredibly sweet stalk. I don't know if you noticed that. And I'd heard that with sorghum too. I guess people press sorghum for syrup in like the Southeast. And so when we were harvesting, I went out one year and was like biting on the sorghum, and it was kind of sweet. And then the corn, sure enough, it tasted like sugar cane, like just out of South America, like when you cut it and chew it like sugar cane, like really sweet. So, we put maybe 3 or 4 mature pigs into each plot, which is maybe like 1/8 of an acre. And we're actually growing in 3 plots this year. We expanded from an old pig paddock from the year before. 3 pigs, we don't feed them for 2 or 3 weeks. They are just eating through all the corn and totally fertilizing. We don't need to bring in any supplemental fertility between the pigs and the chickens. Like within the NPK tests that we do fall and spring, and the soil tests for topsoil depth and all that stuff, everything is increasing year after year without any additional fertilizer. So it's just these like complementary systems, right? The pigs go in, clear everything, so we don't need to use tractors to clear anything or use any machine work. And then right after that, the chickens go in, scrape up the manure, spread the manure, and then they're adding like a higher nitrogen fertilizer than the pigs. So between those two animal systems, it's just amazing what it's doing each and every year in the fields. So I think for us, what I'm really trying to do is model these systems on a small scale and encourage other people, assist other people to set up systems on a larger scale that can be advantageous for soil building every year and can be economically viable. So I think that's just really what I'm in the midst of, is looking at, what does that look like on a larger scale? Pigs and chickens do great here with the grains. Yeah, more on that, but we haven't really been trying to sell any of our grain crops. Thinking about 300 pounds of grain, it's like, and for the number of man hours that we put into it, it would just be insane to think about selling it, But in terms of our nutrition, our well-being, and just our overall carbon footprint, and just, being proud to be able to grow everything that we eat in these really small plots has been a really good experience for us. And then just, like I said, being able to model that for potential to bring it to a bigger scale has been really cool. And just hearing that wheat could be done mostly drylands too, planted in the spring, I think that's a really cool opportunity actually. Maybe before vegetable cropping or between vegetable cropping, I think there's a lot of potential in that, wherever there isn't enough irrigation too. So you kind of got my head turning on that one too. So, yeah.
Out of curiosity, Nick, what does your bed prep look like after the chickens run through it for the next crop?
Yeah, that's a good question. So what I've been doing, and again, this seems a little crazy on any sort of scale, but we've been taking old hay bales and mulching right after the chickens come out. And so a 1/4 of an acre mulch, that'll take me maybe two laborers, a full 4-hour block to mulch both the fields. And then it just sits like that over winter. But we've seen that if the fields are covered, that fertility, like the chicken and pig manure, breaks down way, way better by the springtime. And then what we've been doing is a very light, we'll actually then rake that off in the spring, do a very light till just to incorporate the manure into the soil, and then let the spring rains and spring snow kind of work that a little bit more. And then we've been plowing with pickaxes, so just building all the furrows, or however you want to look at it, like plowing where we're going to plant with pickaxes, and then raking it over, and rain germinating, using the rain and the timing to germinate it. But then something that I've been talking to our soil scientist about, he actually came when we were lightly tilling our fields this early spring, and he's kind of watching me and saying I don't know, do you think there's a better way we could do that? You don't really have to do that. And what he was encouraging was using a broad fork, right? So not even turning in the manure, but just using a broad fork just to loosen the soil, and then allowing the moisture to kind of pull more of that fertility deeper into the ground. But then what he thought we might want to try is not till it at all, just broad fork it to loosen it, and then do the same thing with a pickaxe. So pull deep rows with a pickaxe, where everything has not been incorporated, right? So there's still the kind of hotter layer of manure on top, and then the really well digested, nicer topsoil below that, and just plant the corn and the other grains into that topsoil, and not the kind of halfway broken down manure. And then throughout the season, that would just decompose and fertilize the corn later in the season, because that's actually an issue that we've had in years past, is the corn not having the fertility and not having the water that it needs later in the season. So that really got me thinking about, even less intensive ways that we could manage it and still have good results. And I think all of these things can be simulated with machinery too. So for me, it's been really fun playing around with it by hand, and then kind of cross-referencing the right tractor infrastructure and machinery that can basically do the same thing at scale. So that's been our field prep. Little bit arduous and a little ridiculous when I talk about it. But, we've been able to grow crops where we otherwise wouldn't be able to grow anything. So I think that's been a cool part of the research.
So the next question is, can you talk about the value of grains as a cover crop for soil as well as for a cash crop, and how that can work into the crop rotation as a market grower or animal producer?
I think we've all kind of addressed this a little bit already, but I see the value in these crops, yeah, as much as a cover crop and a crop that's benefiting your soil as part of a holistic system, more so than a lot of vegetables that you're pretty much harvesting 90% of the plant mass to sell. Most crops, especially the market gardeners, are going to take like the root and the leaves of stuff like radishes and turnips and carrots and beets and leafy greens. They don't have as big a root system. It might only go a foot deep. Whereas a lot of these heirloom wheats, because they were bred to grow without irrigation, and same with the corn, they have root systems that go 5 feet into the soil, and none of that's being harvested. And then you think there's probably several tons of carbon above the soil that either your pigs are eating, or you can bale it and use it as bedding, or you can just work it back into your soil. And so you need to think about how you want it to work within your system, because even at a garden scale, if you just plant 50 feet of wheat and you want to harvest it with a scythe, you're going to end up with so much straw that if you don't rake it off, it's going to be hard to plant into almost. But it could be really nice in that if you wanted to follow it up with, like, next season to grow tomatoes there or something, you could hopefully just do a no-till and just dig a hole and plant your tomatoes right into the straw that's already there. But at a field scale, you wind up with so much above ground carbon that in theory you can, without doing much work, you could like rake it. If you grew wheat next to where you were saying you had your other grains, you could rake the wheat straw on top as mulch for animals. There's a ton of potential, but the main thing is you end up with a ton of carbon after an heirloom grain crop, and usually not enough nitrogen, because you're harvesting hopefully as much as a ton or more of usable food that is pretty heavy in proteins. And unless it's a pulse crop, that being like legumes like dry beans and lentils, which I think I don't have as much experience growing some of those more interesting pulses, but dry beans in particular are a really great crop to follow wheat because they create their own nitrogen through their rhizobium mutualism. So they can fix that nitrogen deficit that you have after you grow a wheat or corn crop. But you can also, fertilize with organic nutrients or conventional nutrients, whatever you're into, or put down 10 tons of compost. But in theory, if you want to try and get away from that, most grain crops are creating a very beneficial situation for our current climate crisis, where they're pulling more carbon out of the atmosphere than most other crops would. And especially if you think about a crop like rye, which a lot of farmers use as a cover crop, but there's more and more demand for it for various bakeries and distilleries around here. Heirloom rye can be like 6 to 7 feet tall, and I mean that's a lot of biomass to deal with after harvest, but it's a ton of carbon that you're pulling out of the atmosphere that is super important. So I think just working with your crop plan, knowing that you need to address a potential nitrogen deficiency, and if we all had perfectly healthy soils, I don't think it's a huge issue. And there's certain vegetable crops that aren't as big nitrogen users that, like our wheat crop here, we could harvest and bale the straw and potentially plant something in the fall that might not use too much nitrogen, that without even tilling the soil, because the soil is already pretty fertile. But it helps to do the requisite soil tests and just know the soil you're working with too. I can tell with how much this wheat lodged over that they definitely applied some kind of nitrogen amendment when they were growing previous crops in this field in the past. So that leads me to think there's probably residual nitrogen for future crops. But I know, given that this wheat's going to yield pretty well, it's probably taking 200 pounds of nitrogen from the soil, and that's a significant amount that won't be there unless you grow a legume or add it back in the future. And like Nick was saying, the animal relationship is super important, and sometimes it's hard on a larger farm to figure out ways to integrate the animals, but especially because being certified organic, you need almost 6 months between animals and a vegetable crop for food safety reasons. So in theory, you could grow a wheat crop, run animals in the fall, and then still have plenty of time for their manure to break down and grow veggies next year, if you had the time and labor and market to do that, all that. But yeah, my experience has been, especially seeing it grow so well in this climate, that it's super important for the soil, as long as you have a ways to get it the straw worked back into the soil or harvested, and then subsequently fertilize if necessary. But some of these heirloom corns, the ones that aren't as drought resistant, they can be 12 feet tall, and that's a ton of biomass as well. That can be like 5 tons of carbon, and it's not always easy to bale that, and it can build a ton of soil carbon if you're able to work it in and plant a cover crop on it in the fall. Otherwise, I've also seen on these hybrid corn farms where the carbon just blows away into other people's fields. So it's good to think about post-harvest methods to kind of potentially maybe even just run some kind of machine over to work that corn residue in just an inch or two, so in the winter it can kind of break down, or get your cows or pigs or whatever animal that'll be able to make use of that residue out on the field.
It's quite hard to follow you. Sometimes we'll come after you because I feel like I have such little to add after he's put in so much. Our future at our farm, specifically regarding grains and how they would fit in, I see a future there, but it's going to be specifically so we can grow our own straw and have our own seeds to make our own breads and stuff over the winter. I don't see it so much as a cash crop for us. And then mix that in with the other options you've got for cover crops. It's going to, I don't know how much of the forefront it's really going to take, but I do see that we're about to get more animals and more machinery and stuff as we grow. So having forage and feed for them, and again, like how fast it grows and how much carbon there is and how deep the root systems go is really important to having the rotation of things as we get more and more paddocks running in our fields, and we can go from market veggies to cover crop to animals to then back to more market veggies, and it definitely does fit in, but I can't speak specifically too much as to where or when.
Awesome. Thanks, Keith. Yeah, I think Matt covered just about all the different interrelationships I can think of too, but it's pretty awesome to think about all that. Some things that come to mind for me too are just different bicultures too, like maybe lentils and wheat. I know Matt Ag and Phil and those guys were experimenting with some of that, and then maybe even different complementary crops like growing vining dry beans on corn, a really common polyculture that a lot of people know about, the idea of Three Sisters patches. And I haven't really seen that at scale before, but I think there's a good potential for like vining dry beans. And I don't even know that many varieties of vining dry beans, but yeah. I mean, that's how the folklore goes, is that people used to cultivate a lot of food that way. Yeah, even just thinking about like no-till methods like crimper rollers and crimper drill seeds and things like that, just like rotating between wheat and then beans, or wheat and then other legumes or corn, really brings up a lot of good points with the biomass too. I hadn't really been thinking that much about that, how good of crops grains are to sequester carbon, in that they're leaving so much root mass in the soil. So that's really, really cool to think about. And then if we're using animals to digest and break down the carbon that's above the soil, and then the carbon that's below the soil just gets broken down by the bacterial and fungal networks, I think there is a lot of potential for carbon sequestration and soil building using grain crops and linking animal systems. Yeah, I think more to explore, but I think Matt pretty much covered all the bases on that one.
Thanks, Nick. Can you talk about the community that we have here, and are there people that are collaborating that'll make it feasible to grow grain on a small scale, specifically touching upon like equipment for seeding and harvesting and processing and storage, and what resources would help you grow grain successfully, and what are the biggest pieces of investment needed to start growing grain?
Well, I think this is a great time to be growing grain in Boulder County. It was only like 5 years ago that a couple people came together and started this group called the Noble Grain Alliance, that they were trying to get more farmers to grow, I think more specifically heirloom wheat than other grains. And in the past, there's been, plenty of farmers growing more commercial varieties of wheat, and some smaller farmers, specifically somebody down the street from us here, farmer John Ellis has been doing it for over a decade. at a scale that works for him because he has more acreage and he has the equipment that works for him and he knows how to use all the equipment. But as young farmers, we don't always come with the experience to use these old combines or tractors or like even having a grain drill can be hard to come by sometimes. And honestly, I mean, you can plant wheat or corn just by hand or with a simple seeder, but to scale up, it requires a lot of tools that can add up in price really quick. So just in the past 5 years, I've seen a lot more farmers start to try and grow wheat. Black Cat has bought a combine, I think 5 years ago. Aspen Moon Farm bought a combine. And so these are all older combines that are cheaper to come by, but still not cheap enough that a small young farmer would have the money to spend money on, given that it's not going to have a great profit return immediately compared to a lot of other investments. So it's a hard decision to make, but if Boulder County is invested in creating this amazing local food economy, then it seems like a thing that there would be grant money to produce the tools needed to produce these grains at various scales. And then after harvest with a combine, you need access to a grain cleaner, hopefully. And there's a large grain cleaner out east of here, but you need to harvest about 30,000 pounds of wheat for them to accept it. So if there was something below that scale where there was something called an air screen cleaner and then a gravity table and then maybe a spiral separator, these are all different tools that if you put in a really dirty crop of seeds that, I mean, you could just use something as simple as a fan and a bucket to kind of winnow it, but it can take tons and tons of time. Or you can go to this machine and clean 1,000 pounds of grain in an hour with almost no effort. But this is like $30,000 of equipment we're talking about that most of us don't have access to. But it's a great thing to have a community base for, because not every farmer is going to need it at once. Once you harvest your grain, it can pretty much store safely once it's dry and just be cleaned as needed. The combine sharing can be a little trickier because farmers might need to harvest their stuff at the same time. It's kind of hard to transport them. But I think it's something that we're working towards as a community because it's such a great climate to grow these things. It's a great thing to have in the rotation. And especially if there's more people with no-till drills, we could in theory be planting, following a veggie crop without doing any tillage, just planting a wheat crop for the fall, harvesting it. And it essentially is doing the same function as a cover crop minus pulling some nutrients out of the soil. It's protecting the soil and building the microbiology and fixing carbon. And so I think it's just, having that equipment there, having the knowledge base there is going to allow more people to get involved. And then the market's already there. It's just the steps going to market. And if more farmers wanted to sell the grain themselves, I think there's enough millers in the area that would do like what's called toll milling and will, take either a percentage of the grain or take, 10 cents per pound to mill it for them. And then they have an artisanal product they can sell for a higher value than just selling the wheat berries, wholesale or retail. And then as far as pulses like dry beans and lentils, there's almost none to speak of in the community at large. So you could charge a crazy high price for them given the supply. But like I said, I find how expensive that food tends to be a problematic area where food should be that expensive, because on a per capita basis, Americans are spending almost nothing on their food compared to other countries, but people still need access to high quality food at what's affordable to them. So there's some systems that need to be put in place in Boulder County to make this quality food accessible, but at the same time we need to be able to produce enough to feed everybody too. So I think just getting the knowledge base there, and then making sure if people want to grow these crops that there's machinery they can either rent or have access to affordably, and then being able to bring it to a seed cleaner, and then the mill is pretty much should solve that problem. But I know Matt Ag is doing a lot of research. They're a great nonprofit in the area. Personally, the owner of that's Moxie Bakery, Andy, has been really influential to me personally in advocating for growing grains. He'll work with any farmer to give them free grains as long as they return them to him, which is super helpful when you don't have the cash flow in the springs or knowledge to go out and buy the grain. And so there's a great network of people out there, and there's a lot of farmers willing to help out. But I think, it'll be interesting to see where we are 10 years from now. It's all very exciting.
My answers to what you need are patience and education, basically. Like if we had watched YouTube videos or talked to other farmers about even the names of the processes and the names of the machinery and stuff that we didn't even know we needed to ask for. We're like, we're gonna have hands on site and we're gonna just do it, and that is not enough. Like that is a way to beat your head against the wall and go insane very quickly. So learning that there are various sizes of threshers and there's grain cleaners in the area, and then spending time in the area and meeting the other people in the area who have that machinery and are more than willing to be kind and loan it to you, especially as young farmers and new people in the area. That it would have been, like our next time is going to be better just because of how prepared we are now after that first mistake, I would say. I don't want to put it in such blunt terms, but we were underprepared. So learning about the whole process, why you're even growing it, what the end products are you going to use it, like how are you going to use it, all the different parts of it. Those would just make the whole process a lot more enjoyable, a lot more, if there is some profit, more profitable. And then patience and understanding that it's probably not going to be profitable right off the bat, or as profitable as you might think, or that there's hidden profit to be had in there with straw savings, because you're getting your own straw, and now we can plant our wheat as a cover crop. Even if the seed we did get, we can plant it now instead of having to buy more seed for our next cover crop. So there are just things to learn through the whole process as well. But like machinery is absolutely going to be your biggest helpful if you're doing it on any kind of scale, even a half acre. But combines, it's hard to get someone with a combine to come down and harvest a half acre for you, because that would take them about 5 minutes to do. So again, choosing the right scale, choosing the right system, planning it all out, learning why you're doing what you're doing, and the most efficient, like preferably from someone else who really, really knows, than just jumping into it is going to be my advice for all that.
Yeah, that was a lot of really great ideas too, and some things that I've been thinking about was, especially while Matt was talking, just this idea of there's just so much Boulder County open space around here too that's being underfarmed or commodity farmed. So just sounds like wheat, especially wheat, rye, even maybe barley, could be planted in places where there's less irrigation potential or more simple rudimentary irrigation systems that market gardeners aren't going to want to use. So probably just more support from the county, really, just the infrastructure, or even like the equipment, like maybe an equipment library where we can, as young farmers, borrow, rent, exchange tools and equipment for more easy grain planting and processing and all that. It seems like it could be a really good way to regenerate barren pieces of county land too, right? If we're planting something like wheat that could be sprouted from the rains and doesn't need irrigation, and maybe we can grow a wheat crop, get pigs or chickens out there after to clear the fields, and then do a legume crop after that, or just experiment more with these different rotations. I know there's a lot of land around here that is being underfarmed that the county and the city own. And so it could just be, policy shifts, advocating, a lot of the stuff that Young Farmers Coalition does has been really helpful in kind of building those connections. And Andy, Brighter, and everybody, their team has been super, super good, helpful folks for all of that. So those are some of my ideas.
Great. Can you talk about what scale you think is needed to make a profit? I know you've all kind of touched on it, and it does seem like it will be a lot, but maybe a little bit more in depth on that.
Yeah, I think that is a super important question, because as much as you want to grow these things, I mean, if you're doing it at a garden scale to feed yourself, the value is intangible. If you're growing these awesome grains that you can't even get otherwise, it's worth essentially $100 a pound, and so you can spend any amount of time and effort. But for me personally, I've seen the value in growing the grains kind of make it worthwhile. If you're buying the equipment, you need to have like a 20, 30 acre farm and grow, maybe 2 to 5 acres of different grains. But if there was a tool library and you're able to borrow equipment and you were able to grow it at scale, it's such an easy crop to just plant. And as long as you were able to prepare the soil correctly and know what the weed pressure is, and maybe just mow it if it ends up being too weedy, but since it's not as management intensive as other things, it can be marginally profitable without much effort as long as the resources are there for harvest and the post-harvest. And then you need to accommodate for having less by just selling it at a higher price, which if you're going to the farmer's market or you have a CSA, you can value it appropriately, even though, at the store, wheat's only like 50 cents a pound. I think it's not unreasonable to charge a lot more because of the quality of nutrition and the quality of product you're getting to people, and then the fact that you're taking care of the earth growing it, which a lot of these other farms, people just don't know where this commodities wheat's coming from. Some of it's been in storage for 3 years and just got milled if you're buying like just the cheapest flour at the supermarket. And same thing goes for dry beans and corn. It's all like 2 years old most of the time, and people don't realize that it tastes so much better, even though it can be stored when it's a fresh crop. And then if you just have a small market garden, you can just grow 150 or a 50 to 100 foot bed of dry beans and sell them to your CSA members, and that would be profitable. And same thing for flint corn. But for the smaller grains like amaranth and wheat, it might be a little harder just to deal with the threshing part unless you're more skilled at it, because it's kind of just, there's an art to it. You need to basically beat the seed out of the seed head, and depending how efficient you are at that can kind of make or break your profitability. But I think at the end of the day, all scales can be profitable if they're efficient and if they're supported with the right machinery. But I would recommend, not getting into it on a small farm if you need to make the cash money from like animals or flowers or veggies. That should come first, because that's where good cash flow is going to happen, and then you can build in these field crops as your rotation allows, as your equipment allows, and as you build a stronger network, and as the community and hopefully like Boulder County, it has more funding available, because it is something that just needs to be done and might not be that profitable without having a 100-acre field. Just this field of wheat we have here as an example, the net profits will be about the same as from an acre as from a 100-foot bed of vegetables or flowers. So that would be about 1/50th of an acre. So, but it's still, but it's essentially just planting it and then harvesting it with the kindness of friends. So, but having access to that machinery really makes it possible. But my recommendation would be stick with a scale that works for you, and it's a fun crop to experiment with on a small scale, and maybe save seed like for corn and sorghum until you have the skill and the know-how and the access to equipment to do it at a slightly larger scale. But the market's definitely there in Boulder County for sure, and probably in a lot of other parts of the country. I worked at a farmer's market in DC for a couple years, and there was people selling like fresh grown rice for $12 a pound, and that's where I first saw some guy making as much money growing grains as other people were making from vegetables, because he priced it accordingly, and definitely people had the wealth there to afford it, and it wasn't unfair pricing. I just want everybody to be able to afford this stuff. So part of it comes with convincing other farmers in Boulder County to rent 100 acres to people who are willing to grow like 100 acres of these heirloom crops just to get more on the marketplace.
When I first saw that question, I immediately thought 10 acres. What's it going to cost to get a combine out there? Because doing it by hand was so labor intensive and took us away from other profitable endeavors. Like there's the concept of muda in Japan. It's considered waste in the Toyota process of lean efficiency. Like the Toyota factory is all about that, and you want to try and cut out processes, and you want to be spending time on things that are actually going to make you money. So like weeding is almost the muda process, and these are all the dream of every farmer is to get rid of every bit of muda and have everything just be efficient. Everything makes as many dollars per hour as possible. Is without a tool library or without knowledge of neighbors or some connections to machinery where it comes quick or cheap or both, and you're going to have to hire in machinery from outside, like it starts to be multi 5-10 acres in my opinion, if I was going to do it again for actually trying to make profit. And beyond that, with the knowledge, especially even what I've learned here today, listening to these guys, I have a different view on it. Internal profit and personal profit and what you value your own food at, and potentially $100 a pound if you're getting some special variety you can't get anywhere else and you cured it yourself and all that stuff. It has a different sense of what the word profit means. But yeah, if you're actually trying to turn a business and make money, you're going to need lots of acres, I would say.
Yeah, some things come to mind for me too. I mean, just like exactly what Matt is saying and Keith are saying, just picking the right scale for your skill level, for your machinery, equipment, all of that. And then just kind of in the meta systems level, just really thinking about what kinds of cooperatives or other like cooperative processing plants could be developed around here. And it sounds like Moxie is already kind of making a stab at that, you know, but just if we want to have a local food shed that includes grains, just developing the systems and cooperative infrastructure that allows for that, right? Some folks up in Wisconsin, like Mark Shepard is one of my mentors, and a lot of what he's talked about in terms of success is just being able to cooperatively process, pack, sell, and distribute all these organic products, right? And so it's like, can we develop some kind of grain collective in this area that maybe has that equipment that you're talking about? Because it just doesn't make sense for every one person to have any of that stuff, right? And even the combines, maybe, you know, like if there's going to be grains grown within this 5 mile radius here, like can we be planting at different times and be sharing equipment? And I think just more collaborative effort, really. Which I think it kind of across the board in the local farming movement, I think is important. And it's been really, really awesome to connect more with Young Farmers Coalition and just see people kind of join forces a little bit more. But I think as much as we can advocate and encourage each other and the sort of older farmers in this area to help set up more cooperative systems for growing grains, I think that's going to be our best shot at really having a local grain economy in this area, and then just pricing it according to the input, you know, like setting prices that are fair based on like collective inputs. And yeah, I think all that's possible just like with a little bit more collaboration and networking. So
Thank you. That's all I have. Does anyone in the audience have any specific questions they'd like to ask?
Hang on. I'll give you the mic. Thanks. Thanks, Josh.
So my name is Joshua. Thank you all. This has been extremely insightful. So I farm at a grand scale of 1,000 square feet. I have two gardens at Growing Gardens in Hawthorne and Boulder. So I'm mostly just trying to grow as many vegetables for my own consumption and preservation. Kind of working towards one day, trying to do a bit more of like a homestead operation. And so one kind of cover crop I've used a little bit is like the peas and oats mix. I have a few bags of oats that still need to be shucked at some point, and I've always thought it'd be cool to try and eat them at some point. I was just curious if any of y'all had messed around with oats at all, or had any experience or knowledge about easy ways to shuck or husk or whatever the right verb is, and like process and eat oats.
I can take this one if that's okay. Yeah, I've grown a crop of oats on the East Coast, but it was specifically a hulless oat variety. And so, the shucking that you're talking about, it's oats like certain types of wheat have a hull, and like rice that doesn't come off during the normal threshing process. So you need a special piece of equipment, or I think there might be ways to do it at home with like two bowls pressed together and you like rub them, but it requires some amount of friction. So that might be a fun process for you, but in the future, it might be more expensive seed, but you could in theory buy hulless, they're called naked oats, and essentially the threshing ends up with them being just ready to eat pretty much. I think Johnny's Seed sells a variety, but I have heard of people growing the oats and peas as a cover crop, and then sometimes they ripen up at the same time and you can go in and harvest them, kind of like you were talking about with doing polycropping. I think there's a lot of farmers in Canada, I've heard, that grow like lentils and wheat together, and it all comes down to having the right seed cleaning equipment at the end and having that knowledge of, is this going to work? But from an ecological standpoint, it's an amazing thing to do. But oats grow really well here, and it's another thing not enough farmers are growing. You plant it a little later in the spring because it's not as cold tolerant as wheat, so you don't get it. You probably would need to irrigate more, and which is why probably I see less farmers growing it compared to like barley and wheat for the commodity crops. But yeah, oats are delicious, and you might be able to just get like an oat roller and just roll them and the husk might fall off, but I'm not sure.
Cool, thank you. One more question, actually. It's maybe not grain related so much, but I'm looking at planting hairy vetch for the first time pretty soon. I was wondering if any of y'all had experience or guidance or suggestions regarding timing and anything to expect from utilizing hairy vetch.
Yeah, is that anything?
Yeah, I've always planted it as a spring cover crop. It's always been a little dry at my place to plant it in the fall, but I think it would do well as a fall cover crop too. It's an annual in our gardens. Even in our forest garden, it comes up as ground cover. I've just grown it to 1.5 feet high and turned it in for biomass and for nitrogen fixation. That's been my experience with it.
Yeah, it's one of the best nitrogen fixing cover crops you can grow, and I think there is a variety you might be able to get to overwinter here, but I've heard it can get kind of weedy and hard to terminate depending on what you're willing to do on your plots, as maybe just pull it out by hand before it goes to seed. But yeah, I know it does really well with rye, but I've had trouble getting it established in the fall too. I think it might be a moisture thing, but there was one season I did see it just take off, and it kind of vines up the rye while it's growing. And it's just, yeah, you get just that combined action of fixing nitrogen and getting a lot of biomass.
I have grown it. Ooh, that was loud. Sorry. I've grown it a little bit as a cover crop too, and it can be weedy. Like, you just want to make sure that it doesn't go to seed. So make sure you terminate it before it does that. I do. I was just hoping, Matt, that you could give us an overview of like what we did here to plant the Indian Jamu, and then kind of just sort of a timeline of what happened with it. And then I think we're harvesting it as soon as John can come and help us.
Yeah, so basically when we entered this property in January, this field had just plastic mulch and hemp on most of the fields here that weren't in cover crop. So after getting all that plastic and those hemp residue out, I was fortunate enough that our landlords have this fancy Italian piece of machinery called a power harrow that does a vertical tillage, kind of like a rotary harrow. A rototiller basically does horizontal tillage, and this is like a rototiller that does vertical tillage. And they bought a special model that has a seed box on the top, so it can just basically drop seed as we're going through doing just a light tillage to kind of smooth out the soil, because it was kind of in raised beds from the plastic mulch and hemp. And so I was able to just drive the tractor through once with the seed and just plant and smooth out the field in one pass. And we were, lucky.
Was that February that we did it?
Oh yeah, so that ended up being at the beginning of March, which is kind of an ideal window to get your spring wheat in the ground. In Colorado, spring wheat can go in pretty much as soon as the ground is thawed and you can work the soil and it's not too wet. Winter wheat, farmers plant anytime from September to November. I've seen winter wheat get planted in December and not germinate till January, and it still does fine. The main difference is some winter wheats need a little bit of cold fertilization and are hardier, so they won't die, and spring wheats don't need that super cold period of growing, and sometimes they're less hardy. But I know Sonoran White around here, some farmers grow it as a spring wheat and some farmers grow it as a winter wheat. And so you could take a spring wheat and plant it in the winter and see if it makes it, and then every year what survived is going to do better every year, kind of like your corn breeding. It's just selecting for our climate. But then, after we planted the India Jamu here, I didn't have access and time to use any light tillage tools to kill any of the broadleaf weeds, so we have a lot of volunteer hemp in there. But for the most part, the wheat, with all the rain we had in the spring, it didn't get irrigated once. It's doing great, and until it started senescing, which is the fancy word for drying down and ripening up, allowing the understory weeds to start growing up. The wheat was pretty much out competing everything for the majority of its life cycle, and doing just fine without, I'd smile at it as I walked past, but didn't do much else. And now it's just, getting access, having our friends come and help harvest it. I'll borrow somebody's combine here next week, and I'm hoping we'll probably get about 60 bushels, which is a pretty decent yield for heirloom wheat. That's like 2,000 pounds. And then, it'll either go back into cover crop or get something else planted on it. But I don't mind the weeds at all because it's just more biomass, and as long as we're still able to harvest it, the wheat's done just what it needed to do. And fortunately, a lot of the weeds growing there aren't perennial weeds, and they're not setting seed, and they're not annual weeds that are setting seed. It's just hemp that won't set any weed seeds until the fall. So my main concern would be the weeds out-competing the crop, which they didn't do, or the weeds creating a future weed seed problem, which they're not doing, and also just making harvest difficult, which it shouldn't be too much of an issue. So,
What was the seeding rate?
Based on advice from the woman who we got the seed from, we planted at 80 pounds an acre. And generally, the more hybridized wheats, because they don't tiller as much, which is what's called when it branches out, you would plant those at like 120 to 150 pounds per acre. And I know some other farmers that plant spring wheat at higher density, but I think because we got it in early enough and it had time to tiller and branch out and grow nice and thick and lush, it didn't mind being planted farther apart. But there's an advantage of planting wheat and other grains closer together in that it does outcompete the weeds early on by creating that closed canopy as it grows when other warm season weeds haven't germinated yet. And the same thing goes for corn and other crops. It's like you can do different planting densities in a garden situation where you might be able to weed better than in a field situation where you just want it to suffocate out the crops or the competitive weeds. But so basically, aside from me doing a foliar spray on the wheat for nutrition, it's only been several hours of labor to get it in, and then several more to get it harvested and cleaned, and then we'll sell it to our friends at the Moxie Bakery. So I was planning on irrigating if it hadn't rained so much this year.
Can you repeat his question?
Oh, Nick had asked what our irrigation regimen was for the wheat. And fortunately, almost all the heritage heirloom wheat varieties are very adept at growing in whatever conditions. They have roots that'll basically chase the moisture down into the soil as it recedes in the early summer. But I think in May we got 5.5 inches of rain, and then several more in June, and then any extra winter moisture that was deep in the soil, the wheat was able to access. So in theory, a wheat crops need anywhere from 10 to 20 inches of water in that 5-foot soil profile that the roots are growing. So I have irrigated winter and spring wheat before, and oftentimes it just causes the wheat to grow too tall and lodge and almost makes it harder to combine than just letting it grow however it wants to grow with the natural rainfall. Yeah. So Nick was asking if there was any irrigation at all, and it was just, we just it was essentially the same as broadcasting the seed. It was pretty densely planted. Probably that 80 pounds of wheat seed with probably some like 50,000 plants, and never irrigated. The wheat just kind of knows. It's like, I like to call it plant knowledge. It knows what it needs to do. It knows how much to grow based on the available moisture in the soil. And then I got a little nervous. We had a few weeks of dry spell where sometimes you can get like shrunken kernels if it doesn't have quite enough moisture to grow, because when it's producing that grain, it can go through almost 20,000 gallons of water in a day, and so you're counting on there being that much water in the soil profile that its roots have access to. But then we got a couple more inches of water at the end of June, which could have been problematic if it was heavier. It could cause some issues with harvest, but fortunately it seemed like just the perfect amount. And normally, if you are irrigating wheat, it's best to get as much water as you can on before it starts to head up. And I like to think the same is true with these drought-tolerant corns and sorghums and dry beans. If you can load up the soil profile with water, whether through flood irrigation or drip irrigation, before the crop is maturing the seed, it'll be able to mature the seed without, if you can avoid getting the plant stalk wet, it appreciates that.
Does anyone else have questions?
How is your lodging on the plants that are getting 5 feet tall? Are you seeing significant lodging that's inhibiting some of your harvest?
Yeah, in the field this year of the Indian Jamu, there is significant lodging right now, and
We had a pretty serious windstorm, and
yeah, it was looking good before we got this 1.5 inches of rain in about 2 hours with some hail, and that now it's kind of all laying on the ground, but it's not. I've seen wheat so lodged that it's almost touching the ground, and that can be an issue where it'll kind of mold. But fortunately, most of the weather here is dry enough that after the rain, everything kind of dried off, and the wheat's low to the ground, but I like to think of it as like semi-lodged, and even if I was going to direct combine it, which is where you go straight through and cut, it would still be harvestable, just more tedious to harvest. But we're going to do something called swathing, where it's basically pre-cut and put into piles, and then we'll go through with a combine that has a header that can pick that up after it's dried down a little more.
Did you, when you were using the rototiller, were you just broadcasting seed, or were you actually planting it in rows?
So this Power Harrow seeder device, basically, the seed falls kind of right behind the tines that are spreading soil. So the soil gets tossed up onto the seed. It's essentially broadcast, but it's covered with a little soil and pressed in. Yeah, there's shoots that drop it, but the seed's just kind of scattered everywhere. So if you've seen like a newly planted field of grain from a seed drill, you have all these beautiful lines 7 inches apart, and ours was more uniformly scattered, kind of chaotically. But and it definitely didn't have as quite a good a germination, because some of the seeds were deeper and some were more shallow. Yeah, it was my first time using the machine, and I think in the future I would overseed to account for this. But I think aside from having the weed pressure from the hemp, the wheat seemed to do great at tillering, and having probably every plant has probably 10 heads of wheat on it, so it kind of filled out to the space that it had.
You shouldn't have given the agronomist a microphone. Are you seeing the equivalent amount of stock residue from winter wheat as you're seeing from spring wheat? Because that's been kind of the issue with some of the really large-scale farmers, is they're not seeing that residue amount.
Yeah, most of the heirloom winter wheats are going to have a lot more residue. And then the same thing with corn, like all these hybrid corns you've seen that farmers plant at a much tighter spacing than these, ancient and awesome Native American varieties that you can space out like 2 feet, and they'll also tiller out. They might get 12 feet high, or they might not, depending on how they were bred. But almost all the heirloom wheats seem to get taller. But yeah, the winter wheats, I've seen Turkey Red get as tall as 5-6 feet. But the spring wheats, and it depends on your soil fertility too. But the spring wheats definitely are usually shorter, especially some of those Durham varieties that I've seen people plant this year. But yeah, if ours wasn't all lodged over, it would be 3 or 4 feet tall right now, which I think is pretty it's going to be a decent straw yield, and a decent amount of residue.
I just have to wrap up because Phil has to go. But if you guys have any like concluding thoughts, that would be awesome. And then we can continue talking. We just need to wrap up the video. We could go look at our wheat outside if you want.
More
I'll
questions?
Stop asking questions then.
Yeah, you guys have heard my closing, my spiel about wheat, I suppose. Like I still have a lot more to learn as a farmer as to its applications and uses, and we have to get our own systems in place to prepare for our next time if we are going to do it. We're starting to get into corn, but yeah, just be ready. I don't know where you guys are all at with your grain growing professions and all that, but it's not something to be taken lightly, and when done wrong, it can be very, 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 very large headache.
Thanks, guys. Yeah, it's been really informative to listen to Matt and all of his knowledge and experience growing grains, and being right next to Keith and MetaCarbon and supporting some of the stuff they're doing and working with them. It's been really cool, and I think really my final expression is just to say, I really advocate for agroforestry practices and like these large-scale ecological systems, right? So to me, I really see grain cultivation within those agroforestry systems as the systems are developing, right? So in this area that we're in a desertifying climate, that we're in a pretty arid area, just using ecological systems like windbreaks, hedgerows, perennial tree crops for staple foods. I think that grains like wheat, corn, rye are just really awesome crops to be grown in alley systems within agroforestry systems. So yeah, I just really want to profess that and speak at that to that. And yeah, just interlinking animal and grain systems I think is a really a big opportunity for building soil and just maintaining regenerative agriculture systems. So
Yeah, it's been great chatting with you all today and being up here with Nick and Keith and learning from them as well. And I think just being in this bioregion on Mother Earth, it would be awesome if we had the water to just grow all the agroforestry crops. And I think we can work towards that, but there is always going to be a place for growing these ancient grains, and hopefully we can keep finding more ecological ways to do it. When I got into farming, I never thought I would have, found a passion growing more commodity style crops that I thought was like where agriculture went wrong and started destroying the planet versus kind of creating more holistic systems. But I think these foods have such an amazing history in human culture, and if grown correctly with the right varieties, they have an important place in our nutrition and livelihoods and for our fields and forests as well, if done right and sustainably. And I think heritage grains play a strong part of that, and pulses, legumes, corn, and all these beautiful crops. It's just finding the right way to grow them and how can we get them, these quality products, to people at an affordable price. And that means having more farmers on the land, maybe not growing 1,000 acres of it, or maybe there is somebody who wants to grow 1,000 acres in a sustainable way with pasture cropping and with alley cropping and a lot of trees planted in there. But I think to start, it's just, it's a lifetime of learning and knowing what needs to be done is just growing more healthy food. So thank you guys for being here.
Yeah, thanks everyone.